Imagine a chain of islands stretching across the edge of the Pacific Ocean, where mountains rise steeply from the sea and rivers carve their way down into fertile plains. This is the land we now call Japan. But long before there was any concept of a nation or a kingdom, it was simply a scattering of volcanic islands covered in dense forests, surrounded by endless waves. For thousands of years, people here lived close to nature, hunting in the forests, fishing in the rivers and the sea, and gathering nuts and fruits from the trees. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons, the rise and fall of the tides, and the constant presence of the mountains and the ocean. These first people of Japan, whom we call the Jomon, left behind something remarkable: pottery unlike anything else in the world at the time. Their clay vessels, decorated with swirling patterns and ropes pressed into wet clay, are among the oldest pottery ever discovered. They remind us that even in such ancient times, there was already a sense of creativity, of beauty, and of ritual in everyday life. When you look at a Jomon pot, you can imagine a small village gathered around a fire, the crackling of wood, the smell of cooked fish, the conversations carried by voices that have long since vanished, but whose echoes still reach us through these artifacts. The Jomon were not kings or emperors. They did not build great cities or wage large wars. Instead, they built communities small and spread out, living in harmony with the natural world around them. They hunted deer and boar with stone-tipped arrows. They fished with bone hooks, and they crafted tools with skill passed down through countless generations. Their lives might seem simple to us now, but they were also deeply spiritual. Archaeologists have found clay figurines with large eyes and strange shapes, often broken on purpose. These may have been offerings, symbols of prayer or protection, perhaps connected to life, fertility, or the mysteries of death. We cannot know for certain what these figures meant, but their presence tells us that even in the earliest days of Japan, people looked beyond survival and sought meaning in the unseen world. As centuries passed, the land itself shaped the people who lived on it. Japan is mountainous, with very little flat land, and this geography made travel difficult. Communities were often isolated, separated by ridges and forests, but they were also protected by the sea. The islands of Japan were both a shield and a barrier, keeping out many of the conflicts of the Asian mainland, while also limiting exchange of ideas. Still, the ocean was not a wall but a pathway, and over time new influences began to arrive. Around 300 BCE, a new wave of people and technologies entered Japan from the continent, bringing with them wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron. This would slowly transform the way people lived. But before that change fully unfolded, the Jomon world had already lasted for thousands upon thousands of years, making it one of the most enduring prehistoric cultures on Earth. To step back, before agriculture, before kingdoms, let us linger for a moment in the world of the Jomon. Imagine the forest alive with cicadas in summer, heavy snows blanketing the northern islands in winter, the people adjusting their lives with each season. Their homes were simple pick dwellings dug into the earth, warm in the cold months and cool in the summer heat. They wove fibers into baskets, crafted ornaments from shells, and carved tools from bone and stone. They understood the rhythms of the land, the migration of animals, the cycles of plants. In a way, they lived in balance with their environment in a manner that feels distant to us now, but perhaps also enviable. The story of Japan begins not with emperors or samurai, but with these quiet lives. It is a reminder that history is not only written by those who ruled, but also by those who simply lived. Every fragment of pottery, every arrowhead, every figurine unearthed from the soil is a voice from that time, telling us of endurance, adaptation, and imagination. The people of the Jomon period are often described as prehistoric, but their history was rich in its own way, even if it was not recorded with ink and paper. Their legacy is etched in clay and stone, in the earth itself. As the ages turned, this world would give way to new ways of living. Rice paddies would spread across the valleys, metal tools would replace stone, and clans would rise to dominance. Eventually, these changes would lead to kingdoms, to wars, and to the long arc of history that most people associate with Japan. But everything began here, in the forests and along the coasts, with people who looked at the land and the sea around them, and built lives that lasted for millennia. This is the introduction to the story of Japan. Not a story of sudden empires, but of slow beginnings, of human hands shaping clay, of communities finding meaning in the natural world, and of a people whose voices still reach us across time. When we talk about the beginnings of what would later become the Japan we recognize today, we are stepping into a time of transition. For thousands of years, the Jomon people had lived on these islands, hunting, fishing, gathering, and making pottery that still amazes us with its intricate rope-like designs. Their world was old and enduring, and it might have lasted forever, had it not been for the slow arrival of new ideas, new technologies, and new people from across the sea. Around 300 BCE, something began to change. A different way of living slowly took root, and the society that emerged from it would transform Japan forever. This was the beginning of the Yayoi period. The first and most important change was rice. Not just any rice, but wet rice cultivation, the kind that grows in carefully flooded fields called paddies. Imagine the landscape shifting, valleys carved into squares of water, with people bending in rows to plant seedlings by hand. For the first time, the people of these islands could produce food on a scale that hunting and gathering could never match. Rice meant stability. Rice meant more mouths could be fed. Rice meant villages could grow larger, and families could stay in one place without constantly moving to follow the seasons. Along with rice came metal. Bronze and iron tools began appearing, brought from the Asian mainland through trade and migration. Where once there had been only stone and bone, now there were sharper blades, sturdier axes, and new weapons. With metal came more efficient farming, which in turn meant greater harvests. Bronze bells, called dotaku, were cast and decorated with intricate designs, often showing animals or farming scenes. These bells were not used for war or for music in the way we might expect, but for ritual. They were buried in the ground, hidden in sacred places, as offerings to ensure good harvests or to communicate with the unseen. Society too began to change. The small, scattered villages of the Jomon gave way to larger, more organized communities. Stilt houses with thatched roofs rose above the earth, built to store rice safely from pests and floods. The storage of food meant that wealth could now be measured, and with wealth came inequality. Some people began to rise above others. Leaders emerged, chiefs who controlled land, harvests, and the labor of their people. These were the first steps towards social hierarchy in Japan. Archaeology tells us that burials from this time also reflect the new differences in status. Some graves contained little more than simple pots or tools, while others held bronze mirrors, fine weapons, and ornaments that must have belonged to the powerful. These chiefs, buried with symbols of prestige, remind us that this was no longer the equal world of hunters and gatherers. Authority had begun to crystallize, and the seeds of political power were being planted. But not everything was rigid or somber. Life in Yayoi villages would have been filled with the rhythms of the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer the tending of fields, autumn the harvest, and winter the storing and sharing of rice. Families cooked meals over open fires, wove fibers into cloth, and shaped clay into smoother, simpler pottery than the elaborate Jomon designs. Children ran through the fields, and elders passed down stories of spirits and ancestors. The Yayoi may have lived 2,000 years ago, but their lives carried the same mixture of work, joy, and worry that we can still recognize today. As rice cultivation spread, so too did contact with the outside world. Across the narrow seas that separated Japan from Korea and China, ships carried more than goods. They carried ideas. Ironworking techniques, new methods of farming, and even concepts of governance crossed the water. Japan was still isolated in many ways, but it was no longer a world entirely its own. Through these contacts, the Yayoi people stepped gradually into the broader current of East Asian history. Yet the islands always remained distinct. The geography of Japan, Rugged mountains, deep forests, and long coasts shaped how these new influences were absorbed. Rice paddies could only be carved into certain valleys, and villages often grew where nature allowed them. Communities were tied to the land in an intimate way, with their lives bounded by the terrain that surrounded them. The sea, at once a barrier and a bridge, ensured that change came slowly, on Japan's own terms. We can picture a Yayoi village at dusk, the light fading, smoke rising from hearths, villagers returning from the fields with bundles of rice plants. A bronze bell hidden beneath the soil in a nearby grove glints faintly in the firelight. Children sit near their parents, listening to the crackle of the fire, while elders speak of the spirits that guard the harvest. Somewhere, a chief counts the jars of rice stored safely in raised granaries, his authority built on the grain that sustains them all. This was no longer the timeless world of the Jomon. This was something new, a society on the path toward kingdoms, wars, and empires. The shift was not sudden. For generations, Jomon and Yayoi ways coexisted, overlapped and blended. In some regions, people clung to the old traditions of hunting and gathering, while in others, rice fields spread quickly. The process was gradual, a transformation that unfolded over centuries rather than years. But by the 1st century CE, the change was undeniable. The Yayoi culture had spread across much of Japan, reshaping it from the inside out. In the 3rd century, after the birth of Christ, far away across the sea in the islands we now call Japan, a story was unfolding that still lingers in fragments of memory and whispers from old chronicles. It was a time when the Yayoi culture had already spread across much of the land. Rice paddies stretched through valleys, villages had grown larger, and new clans were rising with their own chiefs and leaders. But as often happens when many voices compete for power, conflict followed. Villages clashed with villages, clans with clans, each seeking to expand their influence, to control land and resources, and to hold authority over others. Amid this turbulence, one figure stood out, a woman unlike any other, remembered not only as a ruler but as a shaman, a woman of the spirit world. Her name was Himiko, the Shaman Queen. Our knowledge of her does not come from Japanese records, for none survive from her own time. Instead, she appears in the writings of China, where envoys recorded their encounters with a distant land they called Wa. According to the Chinese chroniclers, the people of Wa were divided and at war, fighting endlessly until they turned to a woman who would bring peace and unity. This woman, Himiko, ruled not with armies but with ritual. She was said to speak to the gods, to mediate between the living and the spirits, and through this power she gained the respect and loyalty of many tribes. Imagine what that might have meant. In a society where men often held physical power through weapons and war, here was a woman whose strength came from the unseen. She is described as living in seclusion, rarely appearing in public, hidden within her palace or ritual space, while her younger brother helped carry out political matters. The people revered her because they believed she could commune with the divine. Perhaps her voice carried enchants, perhaps she used drums or fire or sacred objects to channel messages from the spirit world. Whatever she did, it worked. For under her leadership, the warring tribes of Wa found a measure of peace. It is easy to imagine the scene. Villages gathering under banners, chiefs laying down their arms, all agreeing to acknowledge the authority of this mysterious queen, who never needed to march at the front of an army. Her realm, known as Yamatai, became a central power among the many scattered territories of Japan. Its exact location remains a mystery even today, debated amongst historians. Was it in northern Kyushu or further east in the Nara Basin? We may never know for certain. What matters is that Yamatai was recognized, and Himiko's rule was remembered beyond her islands. The Chinese records speak of envoys traveling from Wa to the court of Wei in 239 AD, carrying tribute of slaves and precious goods, asking for recognition. In return, the Wei court bestowed upon Himiko a seal of authority, golden and inscribed, along with fine gifts of silk and ornaments. In the language of diplomacy, this was more than simple trade. It was a confirmation that Himiko was accepted as the sovereign of her people, a bridge between Wa and the powerful empires of the continent. For the first time, Japan entered the written history of the wider world, and at its heart was a woman Shaman Queen. What might life under Himiko have felt like? In the villages, rice was still planted and harvested, children still played among the stilt houses, and hunters still set out to the forests and rivers. But now, above the ordinary rhythm of life, there was the knowledge of a higher authority, a queen chosen by the spirits themselves. People may have carried clay figurines, offerings, or talismans with prayers for protection and fertility, believing Himiko's rituals gave them strength. Her presence, even unseen, was a binding force, one that gave meaning to the struggles of daily life.
The Chinese described her as unmarried, without a husband or consort, living apart from ordinary society. Surrounded by attendants, guarded, and shrouded in mystery, she represented something both earthly and divine. Some might imagine her as stern and distant, but perhaps she was also revered with affection, like a mother to her people, embodying both protection and guidance. The truth is, we cannot know her face, her voice, or the details of her life. But the very fact she stands out in the records shows the impression she made. Himiko's reign was not only about ritual. The very act of unifying warring tribes was political genius. By elevating herself as a spiritual leader, she transcended clan rivalries, offering a higher authority that none could easily challenge without appearing to defy the gods. Her brother's role in handling worldly matters ensured that governance was maintained, while she remained the sacred center. It was a partnership of spirit and administration, a delicate balance that allowed Yamatai to thrive. But as with all stories, her time eventually came to an end. The chronicles say she ruled until her death, and that after she passed, chaos returned. The unity she had maintained fractured, conflicts rose again, and only with the appointment of another female ruler was some measure of order restored. This cycle reminds us of how much her personal presence mattered. She was not just a symbol, but the glue that held her society together. Without her, the fragile peace unraveled. Standing back, what can we make of Himiko? She represents a moment when Japan's story first intersects with the broader stage of East Asia. She embodies the power of belief, of spirituality, of ritual as a means of governance. And she reminds us that leadership can take many forms, not only the warrior's sword, but the priestess's chant, not only the strength of arms, but the strength of vision. In a world dominated by men of war, her figure shines as an exception, proof that authority could spring from other sources. Even today, archaeologists search for Yamatai, for evidence of her realm. Excavations uncover tombs, artifacts, and signs of large settlements from that era, but certainty still eludes us. Some say that the great keyhole-shaped tombs of later centuries may owe something to her legacy, monuments to rulers who sought to combine both political and spiritual authority. Whether or not we can trace her directly, her shadow stretches long across Japanese history. So the tale of Himiko, the Shaman Queen, is one of both clarity and mystery. We know she existed, that she ruled, that she sent envoys, that she was acknowledged by China, but how she looked, how she sounded, what words she spoke in her rituals, these remain unknown, left to imagination. Perhaps that is fitting. For a Shaman Queen, half in the world of the living and half in the realm of the spirits, mystery is part of her essence. As you picture her, imagine the flicker of firelight in a darkened hall, the sound of drums beating in steady rhythm, the scent of smoke curling toward the rafters. Imagine villagers gathered outside, waiting in silence, believing that their queen was speaking with the gods on their behalf. In that moment, the divisions of clan and tribe fell away, replaced by the shared faith in her voice. That was her power. That was Himiko. In the middle of the 6th century, something extraordinary crossed the seas and changed the islands of Japan forever. It was not an army, not a fleet of conquerors.
but an idea, a belief, a way of seeing the world. The year was 552, or at least that is the year recorded in later chronicles when the king of Baekje, one of the kingdoms on the Korean peninsula, sent a gift to the court of Japan. Among the silks and treasures was a statue of the Buddha, gleaming and serene, a face of calm compassion, cast in bronze. Along with it came scrolls of scripture and monks who carried with them not just objects, but a message, the teachings of Buddhism. For the rulers of Japan at that time, this gift was more than decoration. It was an invitation into a new spiritual world, one that stretched all the way across Asia, from India to China to Korea. Buddhism carried with it not only religious ideas, but also art, architecture, and philosophy. To accept it was to open Japan to a broader cultural network. But to accept it was also to invite conflict, for new ideas rarely arrive without resistance. At first, the statue was placed with reverence. Those who saw it must have marveled at its presence. The figure was different from anything they had known. The native beliefs of Japan, later called Shinto, were tied to the land, to kami, the spirits of rivers, mountains, and ancestors. Rituals were performed to honor these forces, often in the open air or in simple shrines. But here was a figure carved with human features, a godlike presence, given form, a teacher from distant lands who promised release from suffering. Some saw it as wondrous, others as dangerous. The court soon divided into factions. On one side stood the Soga clan, who supported the adoption of Buddhism. They saw in it not only spiritual depth, but also political advantage. Aligning with Buddhism connected Japan with the advanced cultures of Korea and China, strengthening ties and increasing prestige. On the other side were the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans, guardians of traditional rituals, who feared that honoring a foreign deity would anger the native kami and bring disaster upon the land. The conflict between these factions was fierce, sometimes erupting in violence, sometimes in plague and misfortune, blamed on one side or the other. Imagine the tension. In the court halls, nobles debated fiercely. Outside, people whispered. Was the sickness afflicting the land a punishment from the kami for bringing in this foreign idol? Or was it a test, a sign that new gods must be honored alongside the old? The Buddha statue itself became a symbol of the struggle. At times it was revered, at times it was cast aside. Stories tell of it being thrown into a canal during an outbreak of plague, only to be later retrieved when the tide of opinion shifted again. Through all this, the persistence of the Soga clan gradually won out. They built temples, sponsored monks, and promoted the new teachings. Their influence grew, and with it, Buddhism began to root itself in Japanese soil. The first temples were simple compared to the grand structures of later centuries. But even then, they carried with them a sense of the sacred that was different from native shrines. Wooden halls were raised, pagodas constructed, images of the Buddha enshrined. What did ordinary people make of this new religion? Perhaps at first it was distant, something for nobles and monks rather than farmers and villagers. But little by little, Buddhism began to touch their lives. Its stories of compassion, of the cycle of rebirth, of salvation beyond suffering, offered new ways of thinking about life and death. Rituals for the dead, chants, and ceremonies began to mingle with local practices. Instead of replacing the old beliefs, Buddhism slowly wove itself into them, creating a blend that became uniquely Japanese. The introduction of Buddhism also brought with it a flood of cultural influence. Alongside monks came books and writing systems, ideas about governance, law, and philosophy. Temple building introduced new architectural styles, images of the Buddha inspired new forms of art. The rhythms of Japan were shifting, no longer isolated, but connected to a wider world. What had begun as a gift a single statue and a handful of scriptures would grow into an entire tradition that touched every corner of Japanese society.
The rise of Buddhism was not a smooth path. The Mononobe resisted fiercely, and there were times when it seemed the new faith might be stamped out entirely. Battles were fought, temples destroyed, statues defaced. But each time, the Soga rebuilt, sponsoring monks and inviting more influence from Korea and China. Gradually, their persistence overcame resistance. When Prince Shotoku emerged in the early 7th century, Buddhism had already gained a foothold, and under his guidance, it flourished. But that is another chapter. In 552, what mattered was the moment of arrival, the shock of a foreign faith, the debates that shook the court, and the first hesitant steps toward a transformation that would last for centuries. Picture for a moment that first bronze Buddha placed on an altar in a wooden hall. Light from oil lamps flickers across its face, casting gentle shadows. Nobles bow in uncertainty, some in awe, some in suspicion. Outside, the wind rustles through rice fields, carrying with it the timeless voices of the kami. A new chapter has begun, though no one yet knows how far it will lead. The rise of Buddhism in Japan is a reminder of how powerful ideas can be. They do not need armies or conquest to change a nation. Sometimes all it takes is a gift. A statue, a scripture, a teaching, carried across the sea, planted in new soil, and nurtured by those willing to believe. From 552 onward, Buddhism became part of Japan's story, shaping its temples, its art, its philosophy, and its soul. And so, in that year, a door opened. The old ways remained, the kami were still honoured, but now there was also the calm gaze of the Buddha, a promise of compassion, a vision of release from suffering. It did not erase the past, but it added something new, something that would endure for more than 1,000 years. The rise of Buddhism had begun. The year was 663. The seas between Japan and Korea were restless, and the winds carried more than the smell of salt. They carried the echoes of war. To understand this moment, we must step back a little, to a time when the Korean peninsula was not a single land, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms. Goguryeo in the north, Silla in the southeast, and Baekje in the southwest. Each kingdom fought for power, each claimed dominion, and each in their own way shaped the history that followed. Japan, still in its formative centuries, had ties with these lands across the sea. Among them, Baekje was the closest. They shared not only trade, but also culture, religion, and bloodlines. Buddhist monks, craftsmen, and scholars had sailed from Baekje to Japan, carrying books, statues, and the refined knowledge of the continent. For the Japanese court, Baekje was not simply a neighbour, it was a trusted friend, almost family. But history rarely spares alliances. By the mid-7th century, Baekje had fallen into decline. The kingdom of Silla, seeking dominance, made a bold alliance with the mighty Tang dynasty of China. With Tang armies at their side, Silla struck hard, and in the year 660, Baekje collapsed. Its fortresses fell, its capital was seized, and its king was taken prisoner. For Japan, this was more than troubling news. It was a wound to the heart. Their ally was gone, swallowed by the tide of Silla-Tang power, and the balance of the region shifted overnight. Yet Baekje was not entirely gone. Remnants of its people, nobles and warriors, refused to surrender. They sought refuge, they planned rebellions, and they sent urgent calls across the sea to Japan, begging for aid. In the Japanese court, voices rose with urgency. The Soga clan, powerful patrons of continental influence, pressed for action. To them, abandoning Baekje meant not only losing an ally, but also letting Silla and Tang tighten their grip over East Asia. And so, Japan decided to act. Ships were built, supplies gathered, and warriors assembled. The goal was clear: restore Baekje, push back Silla, and keep alive the bridge of culture and power that bound the two nations. In 663, the Japanese fleet set sail across the waters. Imagine the sight: hundreds of ships of varying sizes, laden with soldiers, armor gleaming, banners snapping in the wind. The seas churned with oars,
and the cries of warriors rose above the waves. They landed on Korean soil, uniting with Baekje loyalists who had gathered for one last stand. But Silla and Tang were ready. Their forces, disciplined and vast, closed in swiftly, and it was upon the waters of the Baekgang River that destiny struck. The battle was fierce, and the river itself seemed to boil with fire and blood. The Japanese and Baekje alliance fought bravely, but the Tang navy was formidable. Their ships were larger, better built for war. Arrows darkened the skies, and the river was set aflame with burning oil. One after another, Japanese vessels were consumed by fire or shattered by enemy rams. Warriors plunged into the water, their armor dragging them down as cries echoed against the riverbanks. The Baekje resistance, though courageous, could not withstand the might of the Tang-Silla coalition. By the end of the battle, it was clear. Japan had been utterly defeated. The consequences were immense. Thousands of Japanese soldiers perished, and Baekje's final hope was extinguished. The kingdom was no more, absorbed fully into Silla's growing power. For Japan, the defeat was devastating, not only in lives lost but in pride and position. It was a harsh lesson. The world beyond their shores was vast and powerful, and Japan was not yet ready to challenge giants like Tang. But from this defeat also came transformation. In the years that followed, Japan turned inward with a new determination. They saw the need to strengthen their state, to centralize power, to fortify defenses, and to learn from the systems of China. It was after this catastrophe that the Japanese court began adopting new reforms, known as the Taika reforms, reshaping their government to mirror the great dynasties of the continent. A bitter loss had planted seeds for future strength. As for Silla, the victory at Baekgang solidified its dominance over the peninsula. With Tang's backing, it pressed further until it unified most of Korea under its rule. This unification would leave a lasting mark on East Asian history, creating a Korea that was stronger, more centralized, and deeply influential in its culture. Yet the memory of Baekje did not vanish. In Japan, the descendants of Baekje nobles and scholars continued to live and serve, weaving their legacy into the fabric of Japanese society. Their skills in writing, architecture, and art enriched the islands for centuries. So when we look back at 663, we do not only see the fall of Baekje, we see a turning point. It was the moment when Japan learned the hard truth of international power, when an old ally vanished, and when a new era of reform began. The river at Baekgang ran red that day, but from its waters rose lessons that shaped the destiny of nations. Even now, if you travel along the riverbanks in Korea, there are whispers of that ancient clash, a memory embedded in the land. It is a reminder that history is not just about victories, it is also about the defeats that teach, that humble, and that force a people to grow. The story of Japan in the 8th century is, in many ways, the story of a nation still trying to define itself. After centuries of borrowing ideas from the Asian mainland, government structures, writing systems, architecture, religion, Japan was now standing at a crossroads. The rulers of the Yamato state had grown powerful, but they needed more than armies and rice harvests to secure their legacy. They needed something lasting, something that would declare to their people and to the world that Japan was a united and sophisticated nation. That something was a capital. Not just a place to govern from, but a grand city, a symbol of stability, wealth, and civilization. The year is 736 AD, and the debate over where this capital should be and what it should represent was in full swing. At the heart of the matter was a simple but powerful question. Should Japan have a permanent capital, or should it continue the old tradition of moving the royal court every time an emperor died? In earlier centuries, death was believed to bring spiritual pollution, so it was customary for the court to pack up and relocate, often to nearby regions. This nomadic system had worked when the royal household was smaller, but by the 8th century, it was becoming impractical. The government was bigger, Buddhist temples were growing in importance, and scribes, artisans, and officials all needed more permanence. Imagine the chaos of moving not only the emperor's family but also priests, scholars, tax records, treasures, and sacred relics every few decades. It was exhausting, inefficient, and unsustainable.
So the rulers began to look toward building something more enduring. They looked at China, particularly the Tang dynasty's magnificent capital of Chang'an, with its wide avenues, walled compounds, and carefully planned districts. For Japanese envoys and monks who had traveled to China, Chang'an must have seemed like a wonder of the world. Bustling marketplaces filled with silk and spices, towering gates, sprawling palaces, and an air of order and permanence. Japan wanted that. It wanted a capital that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great cities of Asia, one that could showcase its ambitions and its growing cultural sophistication. The first experiment had already begun earlier in the century with the construction of Fujiwara-kyo, but the site was limited and political troubles undermined its success. By the early 700s, attention shifted to Nara in the Yamato Basin, a fertile region already rich with shrines, temples, and political connections. In 710, the court officially established Heijo-kyo, known today as Nara, as the capital. It was modeled after Chang'an, with a grid-like street plan, broad central avenues, and a palace complex at the northern end, facing south in accordance with Chinese geomantic principles. But even with Nara in place, the struggle was far from over. By 736, the court was still wrestling with the consequences of this decision. Nara was impressive, but it was also fraught with challenges. For one thing, Buddhist temples had quickly become powerful players in the city's politics. The temples of Todaiji, Kofukuji, and others were not only spiritual centers, but also economic and political institutions. Land, wealth, and influence flowed into their hands, and with it, the ability to pressure the court. Some officials worried that the capital was becoming too dependent on religious power, threatening the balance of the state. Others believed this was a blessing, that the favor of the Buddha could only strengthen the empire. The truth was somewhere in between, and it made every decision about the city a matter of both politics and faith. Another issue was geography. Nara lay in a basin surrounded by mountains, beautiful but also somewhat confined. The city had room to grow, but officials began to question whether it was the ideal site for a capital meant to last forever. Some pushed for moving to other locations, such as Kuni or Shigaraki, which were briefly tried in later years. Each new proposal reflected deeper anxieties about what kind of Japan was being built and who would control it. Amid this, 736 brought with it another crisis: disease. An epidemic, likely smallpox, swept through Japan, devastating the population, including members of the imperial family and aristocracy. In a time when disease was often seen as a sign of cosmic imbalance or divine displeasure, the plague cast a shadow over the court's ambitions. Was Nara cursed? Was the land itself unsuitable for a capital? Superstition mixed with politics, and once again the question of moving the capital re-emerged. But the alternative sites never gained the same momentum. Nara, despite its problems, remained the center of power. When we think of Nara today, we think of its great Buddhist temples and its deer roaming the temple grounds. But in the 8th century, it was a political experiment. A bold attempt to transplant the grandeur of Chinese civilization into Japanese soil. Wide boulevards were laid down. The imperial palace rose with tall gates and painted halls. The markets filled with imported goods, from Chinese ceramics to Korean metalwork. Scribes copied texts in Chinese characters, while poets and musicians found new inspiration in foreign traditions. For the first time, Japan truly felt like a part of the East Asian cultural sphere. Yet beneath the surface there was tension. Some aristocrats worried that the capital's ties to Buddhism were overshadowing Shinto traditions, which had long been the foundation of imperial legitimacy. Others feared that building cities too large would drain the countryside of labor and resources. And still others saw opportunity. The growth of bureaucracy meant new positions, new honors,
and new pathways to power. The choice of a capital was never just about geography. It was about the soul of Japan, about balancing old traditions with new influences, about deciding whether Japan would continue to follow in China's footsteps or carve out its own path. By the mid-8th century, Nara had become a true center of Japanese culture, with its mixture of politics, religion, and art. The city symbolized permanence, but it also carried the burden of uncertainty. The debates over its suitability foreshadowed later struggles. Just a few decades after, in 794, the capital would move again, this time to Heian, known today as Kyoto, which would endure as Japan's imperial heart for over 1,000 years. But in 736, that was still far in the future. For the people living in that moment, the capital was more than just buildings and streets. It was a dream of a united nation, a statement to the world, and a fragile experiment tested by disease, religion, and politics.
So, when we think of this period, we should imagine the sound of hammers striking wood as new halls were raised. The shuffle of officials walking down broad avenues, carrying scrolls. The chanting of monks echoing from newly built temples. And the constant hum of a city still learning what it meant to be the center of an empire. It was messy, uncertain, and sometimes tragic, but it was also the beginning of something extraordinary. Choosing a capital was never a simple choice of where to live. It was the question of what kind of civilization Japan wanted to be. And in the year 736, Japan was answering that question in the only way it knew how. Through ambition, faith, and a determination to carve its own place in the world. In the late 8th century, the story of Japan stretched northward into lands that had not yet bent to the power of the imperial court. These lands, covered in deep forests, rugged mountains, and cold winds, were home to the Emishi, a proud people who lived in ways that differed greatly from the polished halls of Nara. The year was 774, and the chronicles mark this as the time when the Emishi truly rose into view, challenging the authority of the emperor and leaving behind a tale of defiance and resilience. Imagine the northern landscapes, where rivers cut through valleys and winter snow lingered well into spring. Here the Emishi lived, skilled in hunting, horse riding, and mounted archery. Their lives were tied to the land, fishing in rivers, cultivating grains, and raising horses that gave them unmatched mobility in battle. To the imperial court, they were outsiders, people beyond the edge of civilization. To themselves, they were guardians of their own traditions, fiercely protective of their independence. At this time, Japan's imperial government, centered in Nara, had ambitions of bringing all lands under its control. They had already established their capital, built great temples, and set down laws inspired by Chinese models. Yet, the further north they looked, the more they encountered resistance. The Emishi were not easily subdued, and the mountains provided them natural strongholds. Skirmishes broke out often, and when imperial forces tried to push northward, the Emishi answered with swift cavalry attacks, appearing and vanishing like shadows. The chronicles describe how they used horses not just as beasts of burden, but as extensions of themselves. They rode bareback, shooting arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping across uneven ground. To armies trained in rigid formations, these tactics were unsettling and hard to counter. There were battles, of course, some victories for the imperial court, some bitter defeats that reminded the emperor how difficult it was to govern distant lands. But beyond these battles was something larger, a cultural encounter. When emissaries from the court arrived in the north, they encountered people who dressed differently, who spoke in unfamiliar tongues, and who held their own rituals. The Emishi worshipped the spirits of the mountains and rivers, just as the people of the south did. Yet they expressed it in ways that seemed foreign to officials from Nara. It was not just a clash of arms, but of worlds. Around 774, the rise of the Emishi became too great to ignore. Leaders among them united their forces, pressing harder against the expanding borders of the court. The imperial government responded by appointing generals and sending armies northward. Castles were built in frontier regions,
their wooden walls standing as symbols of imperial will. But castles alone could not conquer the wild terrain, or the people who knew it intimately. To the emishi, the castles were little more than targets, places to raid and test their strength. And yet, for all the fighting, there was also exchange. Some emishi chose to ally themselves with the court, serving as soldiers in its armies. Others married into families tied to the government, weaving connections that blurred the sharp line between insider and outsider. This mixture of resistance and cooperation would shape the frontier for centuries.
Imagine a cold morning in the north. Mist hangs low over the fields, and in the distance the sound of hooves breaks the silence. A band of emishi warriors emerges, their hair tied back, their bows ready. They ride swiftly, their horses kicking up frost as they charge toward an outpost. Imperial soldiers scramble to defend, but the attack is over as quickly as it began. The emishi vanish back into the trees, leaving behind confusion and fear. Stories like these travelled south to the capital, filling the court with unease. How could a people considered barbarians resist so effectively? Some ministers argued for harsher campaigns, while others suggested diplomacy and gradual assimilation. The debate reflected a deeper uncertainty about what it meant to be Japanese in this era. Was it possible to include the emishi in the imperial system, or must they remain forever outside it? For the emishi themselves, these questions mattered little. They were concerned with survival, with protecting their families and their lands. Their identity was rooted in the rhythms of the seasons, the loyalty of their clans, and the freedom of the open plains. To yield entirely to the emperor was to give up that way of life, and so they resisted with everything they had. Over time, the conflict would shape both sides. The imperial court became more skilled at frontier warfare, building roads and fortifications to support their campaigns. The emishi, meanwhile, adapted to new weapons and tactics, sometimes even adopting tools from the very enemy they fought. This back and forth was not the story of a single year or a single battle, but of generations caught in struggle and change. In the year 774, we see a moment when the emishi are not just mentioned as scattered tribes, but as a force that commands attention. They are remembered in the chronicles as fierce horsemen, unpredictable foes, and people unwilling to simply vanish into history. And though eventually many emishi would be absorbed into the growing body of Japan, their spirit of independence left a mark. The rise of the emishi reminds us that history is not only written in capitals and palaces, it is also written in the forests and mountains, by people who stood their ground against forces larger than themselves. Their story adds depth to Japan's past, showing how the shaping of a nation was never smooth or simple. It was contested, negotiated, and lived by countless voices, some remembered, others almost forgotten. When we look back to 774 and the rise of the emishi, we glimpse the northern winds carrying the cries of horsemen, the clash of arrows, and the determination of a people unwilling to bow easily. It is a chapter filled with movement, resilience, and the reminder that even on the edges of empire, history beats strongly. Around the year 1000 AD, Japan found itself in the midst of one of its most refined and elegant eras, the age we now call the Heian period. The great capital of Heian-kyo, known today as Kyoto, had already stood for more than 2 centuries, and its wide avenues, carefully planned streets, and glittering palaces created a city unlike anything the islands had seen before. But what truly defined this period was not just the grandeur of the city itself, but the culture that flourished within its courtly walls. This was a world where the brush and the poem often carried more power than the sword, where appearances, manners, and subtle gestures shaped the lives of the elite, and where art, literature, and ritual were woven into every moment of daily existence. The Heian court was not simply a seat of government, it was a theatre of refinement. Noble families, especially the Fujiwara clan, dominated the politics of the time, but they did so less through brute force, and more through elegance, influence, and carefully arranged marriages with the imperial family. The emperors themselves often found their power symbolic, overshadowed by the regents and advisors who guided the state.
But rather than a weakness, this allowed the court to turn its energy inward, to cultivate an aesthetic life that placed supreme value on grace, sensitivity, and artistic expression. Daily life among the aristocracy revolved around ceremony and beauty. People measured their status not only by rank, but by the quality of their calligraphy, the fragrance of their robes, and the elegance of their poetry. Clothing was layered in rich silks of seasonal colours, carefully chosen to harmonise with nature. A court lady might wear 12 layers of robes, each peeking out at the sleeves and hems, creating a cascade of colour, like a painting come to life. Men, too, followed strict codes of dress, their long flowing robes and tall black caps marking their rank and refinement. To be seen in the wrong colours, or to compose an awkward poem, could be as disastrous to one's reputation as losing a battle. At night, the palace glowed with candlelight and the faint scent of incense. Courtiers gathered for poetry contests where men and women exchanged verses as part of flirtation or rivalry. A single well-placed poem could stir hearts, create alliances, or wound a rival with the sharpness of wit. The Heian elite believed that sensitivity to beauty, whether in words, music, or nature, was a measure of the soul. This was a society where falling blossoms, the sound of a bird's cry, or the fading of autumn leaves could move one to tears. To be unmoved by such things was to be unworthy of true nobility. It was during this golden moment that some of Japan's most enduring literary masterpieces were created. Around the year 1000, a lady-in-waiting named Murasaki Shikibu began to write what is often called the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji. This sprawling work, filled with intricate court romances, heartbreak, and the fleeting beauty of life, painted an intimate portrait of Heian society. It was not simply entertainment, but a mirror reflecting the values of the time, the delicacy of love affairs, the importance of poetry, and the melancholy awareness of impermanence. Alongside her, another lady of the court, Shogun, wrote The Pillow Book, a witty and sharp-eyed record of daily life, full of observations, lists, and anecdotes that give us a vivid glimpse into the court's elegance and pettiness alike. While literature flourished, so too did the visual and performing arts. Paintings of the time, often in the form of scrolls, depicted scenes from courtly romances, seasonal landscapes, and religious tales, all rendered with flowing lines and subtle colours. Music filled the palace halls, with instruments imported from China, blending into uniquely Japanese melodies. Dance and performance were regular parts of festivals and rituals, combining movement, costume, and rhythm in ways that enchanted audiences. The arts were not a separate realm, but a living part of court life, intertwined with politics, romance, and religion. Religion itself held a central place in Heian culture. Buddhism had by now become deeply rooted in Japan, no longer just a foreign import, but an essential part of aristocratic life. Magnificent temples rose across the land, their golden halls and serene gardens designed to reflect the harmony of the cosmos. At the same time, native Shinto beliefs endured, with rituals honoring the spirits of nature and the kami that dwelled in forests, rivers, and mountains. For the people of the Heian court, these traditions blended seamlessly. A noble might commission a Buddhist sutra to ensure their afterlife, then attend a Shinto festival to pray for good harvests or protection. Spiritual life was as much about beauty and ritual as it was about devotion. Yet beneath this polished surface, the Heian world was also fragile. The aristocracy that lived in refined splendor represented only a small fraction of Japan's population. Beyond the capital's gates, farmers labored in rice fields, soldiers patrolled borders, and local clans continued to wield power in the provinces. For them, the elaborate games of poetry and fashion seemed distant and irrelevant. But within the walls of Heian-kyo, the courtiers believed themselves at the center of the universe, a shining realm of culture that elevated Japan into a new age.
What made the Heian court remarkable was not only the art it produced, but the way it shaped identity. The ideals of this era, the sensitivity to nature, the pursuit of beauty, the cultivation of refinement, became threads woven into the fabric of Japanese culture for centuries to come. Even today, echoes of Heian aesthetics can be felt in Japan's love of poetry, in its seasonal celebrations, and in the quiet appreciation of fleeting beauty, known as Mono no Aware. As the year 1000 unfolded, few at court could imagine that this golden age would eventually fade. For the courtiers immersed in their world of incense, layered silks, and whispered poems, life seemed eternal, as though the elegance of Heian Kyo would last forever. And yet, history moves on, and what appears timeless is always fragile. The rise of new powers, the shifting balance of provinces and warriors, and the realities of a broader world beyond the capital would eventually challenge the court's dominance. But in that moment, around the turn of the millennium, the Heian court stood as a glittering jewel, a world of beauty and refinement that has continued to capture imaginations for 1,000 years.
The year is 1184 and Japan is on the edge of a transformation that would shape its history for centuries to come. The era of emperors who sat at the center of ceremonial power, poets and courtiers who filled palaces with elegance, is slowly giving way to the age of steel and discipline. On the battlefields of this time, the future is being written not in ink but in blood, not in court poetry but in the clash of blades. This is the moment when the idea of the shogun begins to emerge, when warriors who once served in the shadows step into the forefront of Japan's destiny. Imagine the countryside, castles on hills, banners flapping in the wind, riders galloping across the plains, where loyalty is both a shield and a trap. The great families of Japan are no longer content with whispers at court. They are taking their ambitions to the battlefield. The Minamoto and the Taira, two powerful clans, stand at the heart of this story. For decades, they had competed for influence, playing the game of politics in the imperial palace, trading marriages, and earning titles. But by the late 12th century, rivalry had hardened into open war. This was the Genpei War, a conflict that tore across the archipelago and left scars that would not fade. The Taira had held power in the court, using their ties to emperors and their naval strength to dominate. Yet the Minamoto, exiled and beaten in earlier struggles, had returned with vengeance burning in their hearts. Their struggle was not just about control, it was about reshaping how Japan would be ruled, and by whom. By 1184, the war was reaching its crescendo. The Taira had suffered losses and the Minamoto brothers, Yoritomo, Yoshitsune and Noriyori, were seizing the moment. Yoritomo, the eldest, was not simply a warrior but a strategist, a man who understood that lasting power came not from one battle, but from building systems of loyalty. From his stronghold in Kamakura, far from the glitter of Kyoto, he envisioned a new kind of rule, one where warriors would be bound directly to him, forming a government of the sword. His younger brother Yoshitsune, by contrast, was the embodiment of the heroic warrior, daring, brilliant, reckless. Together they represented the two faces of the rising samurai world, discipline and valor. In this age, the term shogun began to take on new meaning. Technically, it had been used before, a title for generals commissioned to pacify distant tribes, but in 1184, it was no longer a temporary assignment. It became a symbol of something larger, the authority of the warrior class itself. As Yoritomo expanded his influence, he claimed powers that once belonged only to the emperor and his courtiers. He commanded armies, managed land, and settled disputes among his vassals. Though the emperor still sat in Kyoto, cloaked in ritual and tradition, real power was beginning to drift eastward, into the hands of men who wore armor rather than silken robes. The battles of this year show how sharp the change was. Yoshitsune's victory at the Battle of Ichi no Tani in 1184 stunned the Taira. Using daring maneuvers, he led his men down steep cliffs in a surprise attack that crushed the enemy's position. It was not just a victory of arms, but of imagination, a sign that the samurai way of war was about innovation as much as brute force. Stories of Yoshitsune's exploits spread quickly, woven into legends that painted him as a near mythical figure. Yet behind the glory, there was tension.
Yoritomo, wary of his brother's fame, began to see him as a rival. In the shadows of triumph, seeds of betrayal were already being sown. Away from the battlefields, life for ordinary people was shifting too. Peasants who once paid taxes to imperial officials now found themselves answering to samurai stewards. Land, once managed through aristocratic estates, began to be parceled into fiefs controlled by warriors. The language of loyalty shifted, from service to the court to bonds of fealty sworn to a military lord. It was in these ties, written in blood and duty, that the future feudal order was born. For the first time, Japan was becoming a land where political legitimacy rested on the strength of warriors.
The rise of the shogun did not mean the emperor vanished. Instead, a dual system emerged. The emperor remained a sacred figure, a divine symbol whose presence gave legitimacy to rule, but the shogun, backed by samurai, controlled the levers of power. It was as if the nation had two suns, one shining with ritual brilliance in Kyoto, the other burning with military authority in Kamakura. This delicate balance would define Japanese politics for centuries, a dance between the spiritual and the martial. In this moment, the culture of the samurai began to crystallize. Armor was not just practical protection, but a canvas of identity, marked with family crests and symbols of loyalty. Swords were carried not merely as weapons, but as emblems of honor. The code that would later be called Bushido was still taking shape, but its essence, courage, loyalty, discipline was already visible. To live as a samurai was to live under constant tension, where failure was shameful and death could come at any moment. It was a world that demanded both ferocity and grace. The people who lived through 1184 could not have known just how enduring these changes would be. For them, the war was immediate. Hunger, burning villages, families divided by clan loyalties, yet from the chaos a structure was emerging. When Yoritomo was later appointed shogun in 1192, it was not a sudden invention, but the natural conclusion of what had already begun in these years. By 1184, the future was already visible. Japan would no longer be ruled by poets and courtiers alone. The age of the sword had arrived. Still, even as the shogun rose, stories of Yoshitsune carried a different lesson. His brilliance on the battlefield could not save him from suspicion at home. His eventual fall at the hands of his own brother revealed the darker side of the samurai age, that power was fragile and loyalty could turn into rivalry. The rise of the shogun was not a story of peace, but of constant struggle, where bonds of honor were tested and often broken. And so, the year 1184 stands as a turning point. It was the moment when the idea of the shogun shifted from a temporary title into the foundation of a new political reality. It was the year when the Minamoto pushed the Taira to the brink, when Yoshitsune's genius illuminated the battlefield, and when Yoritomo's vision began to reshape the nation. From that point forward, Japan's destiny would be carried not in the silken sleeves of courtiers, but in the steel of the samurai. The world of the shogun had begun, and it would cast its shadow over the land for centuries to come.
The year was 1274, and the winds that swept across the seas carried with them more than salt and spray. They carried omens, whispers of something vast and terrible coming from the west. In the islands of Japan, life had its rhythm. Farmers tending to their fields, fishermen casting their nets, monks chanting in wooden temples. Yet even in the hum of daily life, there was unease. Word had travelled faster than ships, that a force unlike any the world had seen was on the move. A tide of horsemen who had trampled empires beneath their hooves. The Mongols. To the people of Japan, the Mongol name sounded like a storm on the horizon. Tales reached the shores of how they had conquered China, reduced kingdoms to dust, and demanded tribute from every land they touched. For the proud warriors of Japan, the samurai, this was both a warning and a challenge. They were no strangers to war, but what was coming was of another scale entirely.
It began with emissaries. Mongol envoys, stern and unyielding, brought messages demanding submission. "Bow to the Khan," they said, "or face the wrath of his armies." In the court of Kamakura, the words struck like lightning.
The shogunate, under Hojo Tokimune, refused. For the samurai, honor was not negotiable. Submission was unthinkable. The envoys were dismissed, their threats carried back across the sea. Perhaps, some thought, this would be the end of it. But the Mongols were not a people to be ignored. Far to the west, fleets were gathering. Soldiers, tens of thousands strong, drawn not only from the Mongol heartland, but from the Korean peninsula and the conquered regions of China. The armada that set sail was not just Mongol, it was a storm forged from many peoples united under one relentless ambition, to bring Japan to its knees. Their ships cut through the waves, black silhouettes on the horizon, carrying warriors clad in armor unfamiliar to the Japanese eye, bearing weapons that glinted with strange promise and deadly purpose.
And yet they did not break. Sword met spear, arrow met armor, and the shoreline turned into a churning chaos of men and blood. Samurai leapt into the fray, cutting through soldiers with precision and fury, determined not just to fight, but to prove their spirit unyielding. The Mongols pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming, but Japan was fighting on its own soil, and every warrior knew he defended not just land, but ancestors, shrines, and the very soul of his people. As night fell, the Mongols retreated to their ships, their plan to regroup and strike again with fresh dawn. The Japanese forces, battered but unbroken, prepared themselves for what they knew would be an even greater trial. But then the sea itself intervened. Out of the darkness, winds began to howl. At first a steady breeze, then a gale, then a full storm. The heavens opened and rain lashed down, the sea tossing like a beast enraged. Mongol ships, built quickly and pressed into service, were no match for the fury of the typhoon. Waves shattered hulls, winds snapped masts, and soldiers who had braved 1,000 battlefields found themselves helpless against the ocean's wrath.
The Japanese watched from the shore as the storm tore the invaders apart. Flames flickered across the sea where lightning struck, and cries of men were swallowed by the roar of the typhoon. When dawn broke, the water was littered with wreckage, splintered ships, broken weapons, bodies carried by the tide. The mighty force that had come to conquer had been scattered, undone not by sword or spear, but by nature itself. To the samurai, this was no accident. It was divine intervention. Kamikaze, the divine wind. It became legend, a sign that the gods themselves had risen to protect Japan. The Mongols had seemed unstoppable, horsemen of the apocalypse who swept across continents. Yet here, at the edge of the world, their power had been broken. But even in victory, unease lingered. The Mongols were not a people who accepted defeat easily. They had lost this battle, yes, but their empire still stretched across the known world and their gaze was far from turned away. Japan knew this was only the beginning.